The whispers followed Victoria Murphy through the dusty streets of Platteville, Colorado, like shadows that grew longer with each passing day. "Barren," they said, not quite under their breath as she passed by with her basket of supplies. Victoria held her head high despite the ache in her chest, a pain that had settled deep in her bones during 5 years of a childless marriage that had ended with her husband abandoning her for a younger woman from the next town over. Spring of 1876 brought no relief to Victoria's circumstances. At 27, she lived alone in the small house her parents had left her when they succumbed to influenza 3 winters prior. The townspeople had been kinder then, bringing food and offering condolences. Now they only brought judgment. "Morning, Mrs. Murphy," called Mr. Peterson from his general store porch. His greeting seemed friendly enough, but Victoria knew it was merely a prelude to the whispered conversations that would follow once she was barely out of earshot. "Good morning," Victoria replied, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the warmth of the spring day. She hurried toward the general store, mentally preparing her list of necessities. The bell above the door jangled as she entered, and Mrs. Peterson looked up from behind the counter, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Victoria, dear, what can I help you with today?" "Just the usual, Mrs. Peterson. Flour, sugar, coffee, and perhaps some thread if you have any in blue." While Mrs. Peterson gathered the items, Victoria tried to ignore the stares of 2 women examining fabrics near the window. Their hushed voices carried just enough for Victoria to catch fragments. All alone now. What use is a woman who can't bear children? Serves her right for putting on airs. Victoria's fingers trembled slightly as she counted out her coins. The remarks weren't new, but they still cut deeply. Her inability to conceive had been the beginning of the end with Jeremiah, who had been quick to blame her entirely for their childlessness. When he left, taking most of their savings and her dignity along with him, the town had sided with him almost unanimously. As Victoria gathered her purchases, the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and the tall, broad-shouldered figure of a man she didn't recognize. The stranger removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked dark hair and a face weathered by the elements but still handsome, with clear blue eyes that swept the store before landing on her. "Afternoon," he nodded politely before turning his attention to Mr. Peterson, who had emerged from the back room. "Can I help you, stranger?" Mr. Peterson asked, his tone cautious yet curious. Platteville didn't see many newcomers these days, not since the mining boom had shifted elsewhere. "Name's Drake Vaughn," the man said, his voice deep and carrying a slight southern drawl. "Looking for work and a place to stay for a spell. Heard there might be opportunities in these parts." Victoria found herself lingering, arranging and rearranging items in her basket as she listened. "Not much call for hired hands this time of year," Mr. Peterson replied. "Most of the ranches already got their men for spring roundup." Drake nodded thoughtfully. "I'm good with horses. Trained cavalry mounts during the war. Can break the wildest stallion you've got." This seemed to pique Mr. Peterson's interest. "Well now, the Carson Ranch lost their horse trainer last month. Old Jim finally retired to live with his daughter in Denver. You might try there." "I appreciate the direction," Drake said, then turned to purchase a few items of his own tobacco, jerky, and ammunition. Victoria finally made her way to the door, but as she struggled to balance her packages and open it, Drake stepped forward. "Allow me, madam," he said, holding the door wide. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn," Victoria replied softly, surprised at his courtesy. Most men in town barely acknowledged her existence these days. "My pleasure, miss." "Mrs. Murphy, Victoria Murphy," she corrected, noticing how his expression remained unchanged at the misses. Some men's eyes immediately cooled upon learning she was a widow, as though her status were somehow contagious. "Mrs. Murphy," he repeated with a slight tip of his hat. "Good day to you." Victoria nodded and hurried down the steps, feeling the curious gazes of the Peterson women following her. A new man in town would be the subject of much discussion, and she didn't want to give them more ammunition for their gossip. The walk home was quiet, the spring afternoon filled with birdsong and the distant lowing of cattle from the pastures outside town. Victoria's small house stood slightly apart from the others, at the eastern edge of Platteville, where the town gave way to rolling prairie. She had once loved this location for its views of the mountains, but lately it had only emphasized her isolation. As she approached her gate, Victoria noticed Mrs. Wilkins from next door watching her from her porch. The woman's disapproving stare followed Victoria up her own walkway until she closed her front door firmly behind her. Inside, Victoria leaned against the door and closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of relief in the sanctuary of her home. The silence that had once felt so oppressive now seemed welcoming compared to the judgment she faced outside. She moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, putting away her purchases, stoking the fire in the kitchen stove, and beginning preparations for a simple supper. As she worked, her mind drifted to the stranger Drake Vaughn. There was something in his manner that seemed different from the men of Platteville, a quiet confidence without the arrogance she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Victoria shook her head, dismissing the thoughts. She'd learned the hard way not to let her mind wander down such paths. Men like Drake Vaughn didn't look twice at women like her, women branded as deficient in the most fundamental aspect of womanhood. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect spring day in Colorado. Victoria dressed carefully in one of her better calico dresses, a muted blue that brought out the deeper tones in her hazel eyes. Today was Sunday, and despite everything, she still attended church services faithfully. The walk to the white clapboard church at the center of town was one Victoria both dreaded and couldn't bring herself to abandon. Her faith remained strong even when her welcome in the congregation had weakened. She slipped into her usual pew near the back, where she could observe without being too obvious a target for stares and whispers. The church filled quickly, families taking their customary places. Victoria kept her eyes on her hymnal, avoiding eye contact, as mothers settled children and husbands guided wives with gentle hands at the small of their backs, all the domestic gestures that now felt like personal accusations. Just as Reverend Thomas approached the pulpit, the door at the back of the church opened one last time. Victoria, like everyone else, turned to see Drake Vaughn stepping inside, looking somewhat uncomfortable in clean but well-worn Sunday clothes. He paused, scanning the room before noticing the empty space beside Victoria. With a brief nod, he moved to sit next to her. A ripple of curiosity passed through the congregation, and Victoria could practically feel the weight of speculation falling upon her. "Hope you don't mind the company, Mrs. Murphy," Drake whispered as he settled beside her. "Not at all, Mr. Vaughn," she replied, surprised to find she meant it. The service proceeded as usual, with Reverend Thomas delivering a sermon on faith during times of trial. Victoria couldn't help but notice the coincidental, or perhaps pointed choice of text from the book of Genesis, focusing on Sarah's long wait for a child. "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken." Reverend Thomas read. "For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him." Victoria kept her expression carefully neutral, though she felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She was certain several members of the congregation were stealing glances her way. "The Lord tests the faithful," Reverend Thomas continued. "He may withhold blessings to strengthen our resolve to ensure our worthiness." Beside her, Drake shifted slightly in his seat, a small frown creasing his brow as he listened. After the final hymn, Victoria prepared to make her usual quick exit, but found herself delayed by Drake's presence beside her. "First time in your church," he commented as they moved slowly with the crowd toward the door. "Seems like a decent congregation." Victoria managed a small smile. "Reverend Thomas is a good preacher." Drake replied noncommittally. As they reached the church steps, several church members greeted Drake warmly, introducing themselves and welcoming him to Platteville. "Mr. Vaughn," called Mrs. Carson, approaching with her daughter Emily in tow. "I understand you visited our ranch yesterday. My husband was quite impressed with your knowledge of horses." Drake nodded. "Yes, madam. Mr. Carson was kind enough to offer me work and lodging in the bunkhouse." "Wonderful. We're having Sunday dinner at our home today. You must join us, Mrs. Carson insisted, barely glancing at Victoria. "That's very kind, but I've already accepted another invitation," Drake replied smoothly. Victoria looked at him in surprise. She hadn't heard anyone else invite him to dinner. "Oh, Mrs. Carson's smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed slightly in curiosity. "Mrs. Murphy has graciously offered to show me around town after services," Drake said, turning to Victoria with a look that silently asked her to play along. Caught off guard, Victoria hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, Mr. Vaughn was interested in learning more about Platteville. Mrs. Carson's smile tightened. "How thoughtful of you, Victoria." She turned back to Drake. "Well, our invitation stands for next Sunday then." "I appreciate that, madam," Drake said politely. As Mrs. Carson walked away with her clearly disappointed daughter, Victoria turned to Drake with a question in her eyes. "I apologize for presuming," he said quietly. "You seemed uncomfortable, and I've never been one for formal Sunday dinners with strangers." "You didn't have to do that," Victoria replied, aware of several people watching them. "No," he agreed with a slight smile. "But I would appreciate that tour if you're willing." "Seems I should know more about the place I'll be calling home for a while." Victoria hesitated, weighing the impropriety against the unexpected pleasure of company. "I suppose I could show you the town. There isn't much to see, but I'd be grateful all the same." Drake offered his arm in a gesture that seemed natural rather than forced. Victoria tentatively placed her hand on his forearm, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt sleeve. They walked down the church steps together, aware of the stairs following them. The tour didn't take long. Platteville wasn't large enough to require more than an hour to view its notable locations. Victoria showed Drake the schoolhouse, the small library that doubled as the town hall, and pointed out which businesses were closed on Sundays. "And that's the Silverado Saloon," she said, gesturing to the two-story establishment at the end of the main street. "It's where most of the ranch hands and miners spend their Saturday nights." "Looks like a decent place," Drake commented. "Clean, at least from the outside." They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, reaching the edge of town where Victoria's house stood. "Thank you for the tour," Drake said, stopping at her gate. "And for saving me from what would likely have been an afternoon of the Carsons trying to match me with their daughter." Victoria couldn't help but smile. "Emily is considered quite a catch in Platteville." "I'm sure she's a fine young woman," Drake replied diplomatically. "But I've found arranged courtships rarely end well for anyone involved." The comment sparked Victoria's curiosity about this man who seemed different from anyone she'd met before. "Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Vaughn? It's the least I can offer after you rescued me from the church gossips." Drake seemed to consider the invitation carefully. "I wouldn't want to impose or cause any talk." "I'm afraid that ship has sailed," Victoria said with unexpected candor. "Walking with you through town after church has already guaranteed I'll be the main topic at every dinner table today." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well then, I accept your kind offer, Mrs. Murphy." Victoria led the way up the short path to her porch, suddenly conscious of her humble home. The white paint was peeling in places, and the flower beds she'd once tended carefully had become somewhat wild in recent months as her enthusiasm for gardening waned. Inside, the house was small but meticulously clean, with simple furnishings that reflected Victoria's practical nature. She directed Drake to the sitting room while she prepared coffee in the kitchen, grateful for the moment to compose herself. When she returned with a tray bearing coffee and some leftover cornbread, she found Drake examining a small collection of books on her shelf. "You're a reader," he observed, turning as she entered. "Yes, though I haven't had much time for it lately," she replied, setting down the tray. "My father believed in education for daughters as well as sons." "A progressive man," Drake commented, accepting the cup she offered. "My mother taught me to read by lamplight after long days in the fields. Said no son of hers would be at the mercy of those who could read contracts he couldn't understand." Victoria poured her own cup. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Drake said simply, and Victoria noted the past tense but didn't pry. They sat in a surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Victoria found herself studying him more openly than she would have dared in public. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his mid-30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his current serious demeanor indicated. "May I ask you something, Mrs. Murphy?" Drake finally broke the silence. "Of course." "I couldn't help but notice the way some of the townsfolk look at you." His directness surprised her, and that sermon today seemed pointed. Victoria set down her cup, her hands suddenly unsteady. No one in Platteville had addressed the situation so directly in years. They simply spoke around it, behind hands and closed doors. "You're very perceptive for someone new to town, Mr. Vaughn." "Drake," he corrected gently. "And I've found people aren't much different from place to place." Small towns just make the dynamics more visible. Victoria took a deep breath. "My husband left me 5 years ago. We had been married for 3 years with no children. He decided the fault must lie with me and found a younger woman in the next town who could give him the sons he wanted." The words came out with surprising ease after years of holding them inside. The town largely sided with him. A barren woman is of little use in a place that needs children to grow and thrive. Drake's expression darkened. "Your husband sounds like a fool, if you don't mind my saying so." Jeremiah was many things, but practical about his needs and desires. He wanted children, and I couldn't provide them. Victoria was surprised by the lack of bitterness in her voice. Time had dulled the sharp edges of that particular pain. "And that justifies abandonment." Drake shook his head. "Where I come from, vows mean something. For better or worse isn't just pretty words to say in front of a preacher." Victoria looked at him with new interest. "And where is that, Mr. Vaughn?" "Drake, all over, I suppose," he replied with a slight smile. "Texas originally, then wherever the Army sent me and various places since. Been drifting for a few years now. Looking for something in particular, peace maybe." His answer was thoughtful. "Or a place that feels right enough to stay." Victoria nodded, understanding the sentiment more than she cared to admit. Even in her own home in the town where she'd lived her entire life, she often felt like she was drifting, disconnected from the community around her. They finished their coffee talking of less personal matters: the weather, the prospects for the year's cattle drives, the news Drake had heard on his travels. When he finally rose to leave, Victoria was surprised to find that almost 2 hours had passed. At the door, Drake hesitated. "Thank you for your hospitality, Victoria." The use of her given name felt natural rather than presumptuous. "I hope I haven't caused you any additional difficulty by being seen with you today." Victoria smiled, the expression feeling unfamiliar on her face after so long. "Truthfully, they already think the worst of me. Your company was worth whatever new whispers might circulate. Then perhaps you'll allow me to call on you again." The question was casual, but his eyes were serious. Victoria hesitated, caution warring with the unexpected pleasure she'd found in his company. "I would like that," she finally said. Drake nodded, placing his hat on his head. "Good day, then, Victoria." She watched him walk down the path and through her gate, his stride long and confident as he headed back toward the main road that would take him to the Carson Ranch. Only when he was out of sight did she close the door, leaning against it with a mixture of confusion and something that felt dangerously like hope stirring in her chest. The next few weeks brought a gradual but noticeable change to Victoria's routine. Drake called on her twice more, always on Sunday afternoons following church. Each visit lasted longer than the one before, their conversations growing deeper as they discovered shared interests and compatible views on everything from literature to politics. Victoria learned that Drake had fought for the Union during the war, despite his Texas upbringing, which had caused a permanent rift with his family. He'd risen to the rank of captain in a cavalry unit, where his skill with horses had proven invaluable. After the war, he drifted westward, taking work where he could find it and never staying in one place for long. In turn, she told him about growing up as the only child of older parents, about her love of teaching that had been cut short when she married Jeremiah, about the dreams she'd once had for a house full of children and laughter. "You ever think of leaving?" Drake asked during one visit as they sat on her small porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Starting fresh somewhere people don't know your history," Victoria sighed, considering the question she'd asked herself countless times. "I've thought of it. But this house was my parents' home. It's all I have left of them. And where would I go? What would I do?" "A woman alone has few options in this world," Drake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It takes courage to stay where you're not wanted, sometimes more than it takes to leave." "I'm not sure it's courage so much as stubborn pride," Victoria admitted with a small smile. "I refuse to be driven away by whispers and judgment." As May turned to June, Victoria noticed subtle changes in the way some townspeople treated her. Mrs. Peterson was marginally warmer during her weekly visits to the store. Reverend Thomas actually stopped to speak with her after services, instead of merely nodding in acknowledgement. She wasn't naive enough to think their attitudes toward her had fundamentally changed, rather. She suspected Drake's obvious interest in her company had made them reassess their treatment of her. Drake's reputation in Platteville had grown quickly. His work at the Carson Ranch had proven his expertise with horses, and his quiet competence had earned the respect of the other ranch hands. He declined invitations to rowdy Saturday nights at the Silverado, but was unfailingly polite to everyone he encountered. Several young women, Emily Carson chief among them, made their interest in the handsome newcomer clear, but Drake maintained a courteous distance from all of them, except Victoria. His attention to her had not gone unnoticed. The whispers now had a new focus: speculation about his intentions and wonder at his interest in the barren widow, as she was often called behind her back. One warm evening in late June, Drake arrived at Victoria's house unannounced, looking unusually serious. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit," he said as she invited him inside. Not at all, Victoria replied, noting the tension in his shoulders. Is something wrong? Drake removed his hat, turning it in his hands. I had a conversation with Mr. Carson today that I thought you should know about. Victoria gestured for him to sit, her stomach tightening with apprehension. What kind of conversation? He took me aside after dinner to offer some advice. Drake's jaw tightened. About my association with you. I see, Victoria said quietly, though she'd been expecting something like this. The Carsons were among the most influential families in Platteville. He suggested that a man with my prospects should be careful about the company he keeps. Drake's voice was controlled, but Victoria could hear the anger beneath it. Said your condition was well known and that I should consider whether I wanted to tie myself to a woman who couldn't give me children. Victoria flinched slightly at the blunt words, though she'd heard similar sentiments before. Mr. Carson was only saying what most of the town thinks. I don't give a damn what they think, Drake replied, the rare profanity indicating his agitation. He set his hat aside and leaned forward. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. She nodded, bracing herself. Has anyone, a doctor, ever told you that you can't have children? Or is that just the town's assumption because you and your former husband didn't conceive? The directness of the question startled her. No doctor has ever examined me for such a thing. Jeremiah refused to consider that he might be the one at fault. He said his family was known for its fertility, so the problem must be with me. Drake nodded as though confirming something he'd already suspected. And has he had children with this other woman? One daughter, from what I've heard, Victoria admitted. Just one in 5 years. Drake raised an eyebrow. Not exactly the brood of sons he left you to create. Victoria had never considered that. The news of Jeremiah's daughter had reached her third hand nearly 2 years after he'd left, and she'd avoided hearing any further updates about his new life. What are you saying, Drake? I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, the entire town has been condemning you based on a false assumption. His blue eyes held her steadily. And that even if you can't have children, it doesn't make you any less valuable as a woman. Victoria felt tears threaten at the edges of her vision and blinked them back furiously. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, Victoria, it's truth. Drake stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gathering dusk. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I told Carson that my personal life was my own business, and that I found his advice unwelcome. You didn't, Victoria gasped, knowing how such a response to one of Platteville's leading citizens would be received. Drake turned back to her with a wry smile. I was more diplomatic than that, but the message was clear. He didn't appreciate it. Will this cause problems for you at the ranch? Likely, Drake shrugged, but I've been thinking it might be time to move on anyway. Victoria felt a cold weight settle in her stomach at his words. The thought of Drake leaving Platteville, leaving her, was more painful than she'd expected. In just a few short weeks, he'd become the brightest part of her life, a friend when she'd had none for so long. Where would you go? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Drake studied her face for a long moment. That depends. On what? On whether I have a reason to stay. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Victoria found herself unable to meet his gaze, afraid of what he might read in her eyes. Drake, She began, then faltered, unsure what to say. He moved closer, stopping just short of where she sat. Victoria, I'm not a man who believes in dancing around what needs to be said. I care for you, more than I expected to care for anyone again. Victoria's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. We've known each other such a short time. Time doesn't always measure the depth of feeling, Drake replied. I've known women for years without feeling half of what I feel when I'm with you for an hour." "The town will never accept it," Victoria whispered, voicing one of her many fears. "They'll say you could do better, that you deserve a woman who can give you children. Let them talk." Drake knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "The only opinion that matters to me is yours." Victoria looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of uncertainty or pity. She found only warmth and sincerity. "What exactly are you proposing, Drake Vaughn?" she asked, her voice stronger now. A smile tugged at his mouth. "Nothing yet. I'm suggesting we give ourselves time to know each other better, without worrying about what anyone else thinks. And if, in time, those feelings grow as I suspect they will, well, then I might have a more formal proposition for you." Relief and disappointment mingled in Victoria's chest. Part of her had wanted him to declare himself fully, to sweep her into a future where she wouldn't be alone anymore. But the wiser part knew he was right, they needed time, especially given how quickly things had progressed between them. "I think I would like that," she finally said, squeezing his hands. Drake's smile broadened. "Good. Then the first thing we should do is be seen together properly. Would you allow me to escort you to the Independence Day celebration next week?" The annual July 4th gathering was Platteville's largest social event of the year, with a picnic, games, and dancing that lasted well into the night. For years, Victoria had attended briefly out of obligation before slipping away early, unwilling to endure the pitying glances during the couple's dances. "You're sure you want to make such a public statement?" she asked. "Absolutely certain," Drake replied without hesitation. Victoria took a deep breath. "Then yes, I would be honored to accompany you." The day of the celebration dawned clear and hot, promising the kind of scorching July day that would have the children seeking relief in the creek by afternoon. Victoria dressed with unusual care, selecting a pale yellow dress she hadn't worn in years. The color brightened her complexion and complemented her dark auburn hair, which she arranged in a more elaborate style than her usual simple knot. When Drake arrived to escort her, his appreciative gaze made her cheeks warm with pleasure. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. They walked to the town square together, where tables had been set up under the cottonwood trees and red, white, and blue bunting decorated the bandstand. Victoria was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them, but Drake's steady presence beside her made them easier to bear. "Mrs. Carson intercepted them almost immediately, her smile fixed and cold. "Mr. Vaughn, how nice to see you. Emily was just asking if you might partner her for the first dance this evening." Drake inclined his head politely. "Please give Miss Carson my regrets, madam, but I've already promised all my dances to Mrs. Murphy." Mrs. Carson's smile faltered. "All of them? Surely you could spare one for—" "I'm afraid not," Drake interrupted smoothly. "If you'll excuse us, I believe Reverend Thomas is about to give the blessing." He guided Victoria away, his hand warm at the small of her back. "You didn't have to do that," Victoria murmured. "Dancing with Emily wouldn't hurt anything." "On the contrary," Drake replied quietly. "It would send the wrong message to everyone, including you. I'm here with you, Victoria. Only you." The day progressed more pleasantly than Victoria could have imagined. Drake stayed by her side throughout the picnic, engaging her in conversation and deftly including her when others approached to speak with him. He applauded her enthusiastically when she participated in the women's egg and spoon race, and they shared knowing smiles over some of the more pompous patriotic speeches delivered by the town council. As twilight approached, lanterns were lit, and the band began to play. Drake led Victoria to the area cleared for dancing, ignoring the curious and sometimes disapproving glances. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer," Victoria admitted as he took her in his arms for a waltz. "Neither am I," Drake replied with a grin. "But I suspect we'll manage just fine together." And somehow they did. Victoria soon forgot about the watching eyes, lost in the simple pleasure of moving in harmony with Drake as the music swelled around them. When he held her perhaps a bit closer than propriety strictly allowed, she didn't pull away. Later, as they walked back to her house under a sky brilliant with stars, Victoria felt lighter than she had in years. Drake had been attentive, respectful, and unmistakably clear about his interest in her throughout the day. At her gate, he turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Thank you for coming with me today." "Thank you for asking me," she replied softly. "I can't remember when I've enjoyed a celebration more." Drake's eyes searched her face in the moonlight. "May I call on you tomorrow?" "Yes," Victoria answered without hesitation. "I'd like that very much." He lifted one of her hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the gesture sending warmth spreading through her. "Until tomorrow, then." Victoria watched him walk away before entering her house, her mind and heart too full for sleep. Instead, she sat on her porch swing, replaying the day in her mind and allowing herself, for the first time in years, to imagine a future filled with something other than loneliness. True to his word, Drake called on her the next day, and nearly every day thereafter when his work at the ranch allowed. July passed in a blur of long conversations, shared meals, and increasingly tender moments. By August, it was clear to everyone in Platteville that Drake Vaughn was courting Victoria Murphy in earnest, despite the continued disapproval of certain influential townspeople. The Carsons, in particular, made their displeasure known. Drake's work situation at the ranch grew increasingly strained as Mr. Carson found fault with his handling of the horses and assigned him the least desirable tasks. When Drake refused to be provoked into quitting, Carson finally confronted him directly. "I'm reducing your wages," he announced one evening as Drake returned from the corral. "Can't justify paying top dollar when your mind's clearly not on your work." Drake regarded him steadily. "My work hasn't suffered, and you know it. The new stallion is breaking nicely, and even your foreman commented on how well the yearlings are coming along." "Nevertheless," Carson replied, his expression hard, "times are tight, take it or leave it." It was the opening Drake had been waiting for. "I'll leave it then. And the position?" He untied his horse from the hitching post. "I'll collect my things from the bunkhouse and be gone within the hour." Carson's surprise was evident. He'd clearly expected Drake to accept the reduced wages rather than leave. "Don't come crawling back when that barren widow can't support you." Drake's hand moved to his gun belt almost involuntarily before he caught himself. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "You do well to never speak of Mrs. Murphy in those terms again, Carson. Not if you want to keep all your teeth." He mounted his horse and rode toward the bunkhouse without looking back, his decision already made. He'd been planning this move for weeks, ever since he'd had a promising conversation with Harold Miller, who owned the livery stable in town. Miller was getting on in years and had mentioned wanting to take on a partner, someone who knew horses and could eventually take over the business. Within 2 hours, Drake had moved his few possessions into a small room above the livery stable and shaken hands with Miller on a partnership agreement. The older man was delighted to have someone of Drake's expertise joining him, and made it clear that he considered Victoria a respectable woman who'd been treated poorly by the town. When Drake told Victoria about the change in his circumstances that evening, she was both concerned and secretly pleased that he would now be living in town rather than at the distant ranch. "Are you certain this is what you want?" she asked as they sat on her porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "The livery won't pay what Carson did, at least not at first." "It's exactly what I want," Drake assured her, his arm resting comfortably along the back of the swing behind her shoulders. "I'll be my own man, building something that could last, and I'll be closer to you." Victoria smiled, allowing herself to lean slightly into his side. "I can't deny I like the sound of that." Drake's hand moved to gently stroke her shoulder. "There's something else I've been wanting to discuss with you, Victoria." Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. "Oh, yes." He shifted to face her more directly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about my future, about what I want." Victoria held her breath, afraid to hope too much yet unable to stop herself. "I came to Platteville not expecting to stay long," Drake continued. "Just another stop on a road that didn't seem to have a destination, and then I met you." His eyes held hers steadily in the fading light. "Suddenly, I found myself thinking about putting down roots, about building a life in one place, with one person, Drake." Victoria whispered, her voice catching. He took her hands in his expression serious yet tender. "I love you, Victoria. I think I've loved you since that first Sunday when you let me sit beside you in church. I know it hasn't been very long, and I know the town has its opinions about us both, but none of that matters to me. What matters is how I feel when I'm with you, and how empty the world seems when we're apart." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes, blurring her vision of his beloved face. "I love you too," she managed to say, the words feeling both momentous and utterly natural. Drake's smile lit his entire face. "Then would you do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Victoria answered without hesitation, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "Yes, I will marry you, Drake Vaughn." He gathered her into his arms then, his kiss both gentle and filled with promise. Victoria responded with all the love she'd kept contained for so long, finally allowing herself to believe that happiness might be possible after all. When they finally broke apart, Drake rested his forehead against hers. "I want you to know something important," he said softly. "I'm marrying you because I love you, your mind, your heart, your spirit. Whether we have children or not doesn't change that love. I want to build a life with you, Victoria, whatever that life may hold." Fresh tears spilled down Victoria's cheeks at his words. "I never thought I'd find someone who could love me knowing what everyone believes about me." Drake brushed the tears away with his thumbs. "What everyone believes doesn't matter. What's true does. And what's true is that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I'll spend the rest of my life grateful that you've chosen me." They sat together on the porch swing until the stars were thick overhead, making plans for their future and savoring the knowledge of their love for each other. When Drake finally left for the night, Victoria closed her door feeling as though she'd awakened from a long, dark dream into sunlight. News of their engagement spread quickly through Platteville. Reactions were mixed. Some, like the Millers and the Petersons, offered genuine congratulations, while others, the Carsons' chief among them, made their disapproval clear with cold stares and pointed absences from church on the Sunday when Reverend Thomas announced the upcoming nuptials. Victoria found she cared less about the negative reactions than she would have expected. Drake's love had given her a strength she hadn't known she possessed, allowing her to hold her head high in the face of whispers and sidelong glances. They decided on a simple ceremony to be held in mid-September, giving them time to prepare, but not so long that they would have to endure prolonged speculation from the town. Drake worked diligently at the livery, impressing Miller with his knowledge and work ethic, while Victoria set about readying her home soon to be their home for married life. The week before the wedding, Victoria was arranging flowers on her kitchen table when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Wilkins from next door standing on her porch, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilkins," Victoria greeted her, surprised by the visit. Her neighbor had barely spoken to her in years. "Victoria," Mrs. Wilkins nodded, clutching a wrapped package. "May I come in for a moment?" "Of course." Victoria stepped back, curious. Mrs. Wilkins entered and stood awkwardly in the small sitting room. "I've brought you something. A wedding gift of sorts." She extended the package. Victoria accepted it with murmured thanks and carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a beautiful handmade quilt in shades of blue and cream. "It's lovely," she said sincerely, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. Mrs. Wilkins cleared her throat. "It's a wedding ring pattern. My mother made it for me when I married, and, well, I never had a daughter to pass it to." She hesitated, then added, "I wanted to say that I'm happy for you, Victoria. Mr. Vaughn seems like a good man." Victoria was touched by the unexpected gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins. That means a great deal to me." The older woman nodded, then said abruptly, "I've not been a good neighbor to you these past years. After your husband left, I judged you harshly. It wasn't right." Victoria wasn't sure how to respond to the sudden confession. "You weren't alone in that judgment." "No, but that doesn't make it right," Mrs. Wilkins sighed. "My Thomas and I tried for 7 years before our first son came along. 7 years of wondering if there was something wrong with me. I should have remembered that feeling when people started whispering about you. 7 years." Victoria repeated, surprised. "Yes, and then 3 more before our second." Mrs. Wilkins' expression softened with memory. "The doctor said sometimes these things just take time or happen when you least expect them." She met Victoria's gaze directly. "Don't let anyone tell you what's possible or impossible for your future, my dear. Least of all those who have no right to an opinion on the matter." The wedding day dawned clear and mild, a perfect September morning with just a hint of autumn in the air. Victoria dressed in a new gown of pale blue silk, not white, which she felt would have been inappropriate for a widow, but still festive and becoming. She wore her mother's pearl earrings and arranged her hair simply, with a small wreath of white roses. Drake had spent the night at the livery to observe tradition and would meet her at the church. As Victoria prepared to leave her house, another knock came at her door. She opened it to find Emily Carson standing on her porch. "Miss Carson," Victoria said, unable to hide her surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." Emily looked uncomfortable but determined. "May I speak with you for a moment, Mrs. Murphy? It's important." Victoria nodded, stepping back to allow her inside. Emily was dressed formally, clearly intending to attend the wedding despite her parents' known disapproval. "You look beautiful," Emily said once inside, her voice sincere if somewhat strained. "Thank you," Victoria replied, still puzzled by the visit. Emily twisted her hands together nervously. "I wanted to apologize for my parents' behavior toward you and Mr. Vaughn, and for my own as well. I was unkind in my disappointment when he showed interest in you instead of me." Victoria was touched by the young woman's honesty. "That's very gracious of you, Emily, but you have nothing to apologize for. It's natural to feel disappointed when someone you admire doesn't return your feelings." "Perhaps," Emily conceded, "but it wasn't right to join in the unkind talk about you, especially when—" She hesitated, then continued with obvious effort. "When I know firsthand that what people say isn't always true." Victoria tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" Emily took a deep breath. "My mother had 3 children in 5 years, then none for the next 15. People whispered that she was used up or that my father must be looking elsewhere. It was cruel and false, but people said it anyway." Her eyes met Victoria's directly. "Just as they've been cruel and likely false about you." Victoria was moved by the unexpected support. "Thank you for telling me this, Emily. It means a great deal, especially today." Emily nodded. "I'll be at the church." So will a few others who have realized they misjudged you and Mr. Vaughn for seeing what the rest of us were too blind to notice. When Emily had gone, Victoria took a final look around her house, the home where she'd known such loneliness, but which would now be filled with love. With a deep breath, she stepped outside and began the walk to the church, her heart light with anticipation. The church was more full than Victoria had dared to hope, with nearly half the town in attendance. As she entered, she saw Drake standing at the front beside Reverend Thomas, looking handsome and somewhat nervous in a new dark suit. When he turned and saw her, his face transformed with a smile of such joy that Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes. The ceremony was simple and deeply moving. When the time came to exchange vows, Drake's voice rang clear and strong through the church as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Victoria for all the days of his life. When he slipped the gold band onto her finger, his hands were steady and sure. Victoria's own vows were spoken from the depths of her heart, her voice growing stronger with each word as she pledged herself to this man who had brought light back into her world. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Drake gathered Victoria into his arms for a kiss that managed to be both properly restrained for church and full of promise for later. The congregation's applause seemed genuinely happy, even from some who had been among her harshest critics. The reception was held in the town square, where tables had been set up under the trees and food prepared by well-wishers created a substantial feast. Victoria was surprised and touched by how many people approached to offer sincere congratulations. Even Mr. Peterson, who had often been cold to her in the past, shook Drake's hand vigorously and told Victoria he'd always thought she deserved happiness. Mrs. Wilkins had organized a group of women to decorate the square with flowers and ribbons, and Miller had contributed a small barrel of his best whiskey for toasts. The Carsons were conspicuously absent, but their absence hardly dimmed the celebration. As the afternoon wore on, Drake found a quiet moment to take Victoria's hand and lead her slightly away from the festivities. "Happy?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. Drake squeezed her hand. "There's something I've been wanting to give you, but I wanted to wait until we were married." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Victoria opened it carefully to find a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Open it," Drake urged softly. Inside was a tiny inscription, "For all our tomorrows." Victoria looked up at him, her heart full. "I love you, Drake Vaughn." "And I love you, Victoria Vaughn," he replied, the new name sending a thrill through her. He fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers lingering on her skin. "Ready to start our life together?" "I've been ready since the moment I met you," she answered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, heedless of the watching townsfolk. As the sun began to set, they bid farewell to their guests and walked hand in hand to Victoria's house, their house now. On the porch, Drake stopped and swept Victoria into his arms. "I believe this is traditional," he said with a smile, carrying her across the threshold. Inside, with the door closed against the world, Drake set Victoria gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn." The weeks that followed were the happiest of Victoria's life. Marriage to Drake was everything she had hoped for and more. He was a considerate, passionate husband who treated her as a partner in all things. They settled into a comfortable routine, with Drake working at the livery during the day and coming home to Victoria in the evenings. They would share meals, talk about their days, and often read together before retiring to their bedroom. where Drake showed Victoria the depths of physical love she had never experienced in her previous marriage. By November, Victoria had noticed a change in the town's attitude toward her. Being Drake Vaughn's wife had given her a new status in Platteville. Women who had previously avoided her now invited her to quilting circles and socials. Men tipped their hats respectfully when she passed on the street. Even the Carsons had grudgingly begun to acknowledge her with stiff nods when they encountered each other. But the most significant change came from within Victoria herself. Drake's love had restored her confidence and sense of self-worth. She began to volunteer at the school one afternoon a week, helping with reading lessons, and found that she still had a passion for teaching. "You're good with the children," Drake observed one evening after Victoria had recounted a particularly amusing incident with one of her young students. "They respond to you." Victoria smiled, setting aside her mending. "I've always loved teaching. It was one of the hardest things to give up when I married Jeremiah." Drake regarded her thoughtfully. "Perhaps you should consider taking it up again more formally." "I hear Miss Thompson is thinking of returning east to care for her ailing mother. The school board will need a new teacher." The suggestion startled Victoria. "Do you really think they would consider me?" "Why wouldn't they? You're educated, experienced, and the children already like you." Drake came to sit beside her, taking her hand. "You shouldn't let the past limit your future, Victoria. Not anymore." His faith in her was humbling and empowering. When Miss Thompson did indeed announce her departure in December, Victoria gathered her courage and applied for the position. To her surprise and delight, the school board voted unanimously to appoint her as Platteville's new teacher beginning after the Christmas holiday. December brought heavy snow and the first Christmas of their marriage. Drake surprised Victoria with a beautiful pine tree cut from the foothills and decorated with candles, and the few ornaments she'd inherited from her parents. They exchanged simple gifts, a hand-knitted scarf from Victoria for Drake, and a set of leather-bound books from Drake for Victoria. But the greatest gift came on Christmas morning when Victoria, who had been feeling unusually tired and queasy for several weeks, realized that her monthly courses were late. Very late. She waited until they had finished their Christmas dinner to share her suspicion with Drake. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for, joy mingled with concern for her well-being and a tender protectiveness that brought tears to her eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked, holding her hands tightly. "Not completely," Victoria admitted, "but I think so. All the signs are there." Drake's smile was radiant. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "If I'm right, the child would come in late summer," Victoria said, doing her best to calculate. "I'll need to speak with Mrs. Miller. She's the closest thing Platteville has to a midwife." Drake pulled her into his arms, cradling her head against his chest. "We'll make sure you have the best care possible." His voice grew serious. "But Victoria, I meant what I said before we married. Even if this hadn't happened, even if we never had children, my love for you wouldn't change." "I know," she whispered, feeling truly blessed, "but I can't deny I'm happy. So happy." Mrs. Miller confirmed Victoria's pregnancy in early January, estimating that the baby would arrive in late July or early August. The news spread quickly through Platteville, and Victoria found herself the recipient of more genuine good wishes than she had experienced in years. Some of the older women who had been most critical of her barrenness now pretended they had never doubted her ability to conceive, offering advice and hand-me-down baby items with an enthusiasm that might have been irritating if Victoria hadn't been so amused by their about-face. Only Mrs. Wilkins addressed the situation directly, stopping by one afternoon in February with a basket of preserves and knitted baby blankets. "I told you not to let anyone tell you what was possible," she said with a satisfied smile. Some things just take the right time and the right man. Victoria laughed, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. You were right, Mrs. Wilkins, though I suspect the right man was the more important factor. No doubt, the older woman agreed. Mr. Vaughn looks at you the way a man should look at his wife, like you hang the moon and stars. Victoria continued teaching through the spring, with the school board's blessing. Her students were delighted by her pregnancy, especially the younger girls who took to bringing her wildflowers and asking endless questions about the baby. Drake was attentive to the point of hovering sometimes, making sure Victoria didn't overexert herself and taking on more household chores as her pregnancy progressed. His partnership with Miller at the livery was thriving, bringing in a steady income that allowed them to set aside money for the baby and make some improvements to their home. In April, they converted the small spare room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and setting up the cradle that Drake had painstakingly built in the evenings. Victoria sewed curtains and blankets while Drake constructed a rocking chair that he placed by the window. For those nights when the baby won't sleep, he explained, running his hand along the smooth wood. My mother always said a good rocking chair is essential for new parents. As Victoria's belly grew rounder and her movements more awkward, Drake's tenderness only increased. He would massage her aching back in the evenings and read aloud to her when she was too tired to hold a book. When the baby's kicks became visible through her skin, he would watch in fascination, his hand gentle on her stomach as he felt their child move. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. A wife, a home, a child on the way. After the war, I wasn't sure I deserved any kind of happiness. Victoria turned to face him, touching his cheek. Why would you think that? Drake was quiet for a moment. I saw and did things during those years that haunt me still. Took lives that can't be returned. You were a soldier doing what was necessary in war, Victoria said softly. Yes, but that doesn't erase the weight of it. His eyes were distant with memory. When the fighting ended, I couldn't go back to Texas. My family had disowned me for fighting for the Union. I couldn't settle anywhere else either. Something in me was too restless too. Broken, I suppose. And now? Victoria asked, her heart aching for the pain he still carried. Drake's expression softened as he looked at her. Now I'm healing. You've given me that, Victoria, a reason to be whole again. You and this little one. His hand moved gently over her stomach where the baby kicked as if in response. In June, as Victoria entered her 8th month, the summer heat became increasingly uncomfortable. Drake insisted she reduce her teaching hours, and the school board agreed to let her assistant, a capable young woman named Alice, take over most of the daily lessons while Victoria supervised and planned. One particularly hot Sunday in late June, Victoria was preparing for church when a sharp pain caught her by surprise, making her gasp and reach for the edge of the dresser to steady herself. Drake was at her side instantly. What is it? What's wrong? Just a pain, Victoria assured him as it subsided. Probably just the baby shifting. Mrs. Miller says that happens more in the last months. Drake didn't look convinced. Perhaps we should stay home today. It's too hot for you to be out. Victoria shook her head, determined. I'm fine, truly. And I want to go to church. What she didn't say was how important it had become to her to be seen there, proud of her condition rather than ashamed of her supposed barrenness. Each Sunday felt like a quiet vindication. Drake relented, but insisted on taking the buggy rather than walking the short distance to the church. Victoria was secretly grateful for his insistence when another pain, sharper than the first, came as they were nearly at the church steps. She She must have paled because Drake's arm tightened around her waist. "That's it, we're going back home." "No," Victoria said firmly once the pain passed. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. The baby isn't due for another month at least." Reluctantly, Drake escorted her into the church, finding their usual pew near the front a significant change from Victoria's former position at the back. She settled herself as comfortably as possible, aware of Drake's concerned gaze. Reverend Thomas was in fine form that morning, delivering a sermon on faith and perseverance that seemed particularly appropriate given Victoria's journey. She listened attentively, trying to ignore the occasional twinges of discomfort. About halfway through the service, however, a pain unlike anything she'd felt before seized her, intense enough that she couldn't suppress a small cry. Drake was immediately alert, his arm around her shoulders. "Victoria," he whispered anxiously. She couldn't answer, the pain robbing her of breath. When it finally subsided, she looked up to find not only Drake but several nearby congregants watching her with concern. "I think," she whispered shakily, "that perhaps we should go home after all." Drake didn't wait for further confirmation. He helped her to her feet, nodding apologetically to Reverend Thomas, who paused in his sermon with a look of understanding. They had barely reached the church steps when Victoria felt a rush of warm fluid down her legs, soaking her skirts. "Drake," she gasped, clutching his arm. "The baby, it's coming." Drake's face registered shock, then determination. "It's too early," he said, but his actions belied his words as he swept Victoria into his arms and carried her toward their buggy. Mrs. Miller, who had been in church and followed them outside, hurried over. "Bring her to your home, Mr. Vaughn," she directed calmly. "I'll gather my things and be there directly. And don't worry about the timing. Babies come when they're ready, not when we expect them." The ride home was punctuated by increasingly frequent pains that left Victoria gripping Drake's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. By the time they reached their house, she was panting through contractions that seemed to be coming one on top of another. Drake carried her inside and straight to their bedroom, his face a mask of controlled panic as he helped her out of her wet clothes and into a nightgown. "What can I do?" he asked, pushing her damp hair back from her forehead. "Stay with me," Victoria managed between pains. "Just stay with me." Mrs. Miller arrived moments later, bringing with her an air of calm competence that helped ease both Victoria's and Drake's fears. She examined Victoria quickly and efficiently. "The baby is definitely coming today," she announced, "and coming fast." First babies usually take their time, but this little one seems eager to meet the world. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and effort for Victoria. Drake never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, and murmuring encouragement as she labored to bring their child into the world. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he told her as she struggled through a particularly difficult contraction. "You can do this, Victoria. I know you can." As the afternoon waned toward evening, Mrs. Miller announced that it was nearly time. "With the next pain, Victoria, I need you to push with all your might." Victoria nodded, gathering her remaining strength. Drake supported her from behind, his arms cradling her as she bore down with the next contraction, a cry tearing from her throat with the effort. "That's it, Mrs. Miller encouraged. "I can see the head. One more big push." With one final, tremendous effort, Victoria felt the baby slip from her body, and a moment later, a thin, indignant wail filled the room. "A boy," Mrs. Miller announced, quickly wrapping the tiny, red-faced infant in a clean cloth. "A fine, healthy boy." Tears streamed down Victoria's face as Mrs. Miller placed the swaddled baby on her chest, Drake's arm still around them both. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tracing a finger over the perfect miniature features. Drake seemed unable to speak, his eyes fixed on the tiny being they had created. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with emotion. "He's perfect," he said simply. "You're both perfect, Mrs. Miller efficiently handled the afterbirth and helped clean Victoria while Drake held their son, his large hands infinitely gentle with the small bundle. "He's small, being a few weeks early," Mrs. Miller said as she prepared to leave, "but strong and well-formed. Keep him warm and feed him often, and he'll thrive." She smiled at the new parents. "You've done well, both of you." When they were alone, Drake returned the baby to Victoria's arms and sat beside them on the bed, his expression one of wonder. "What shall we call him?" he asked. Victoria studied the tiny face, already showing hints of Drake's strong features. "I was thinking perhaps James, after my father." "James," Drake repeated, testing the name. "James Vaughn, it's a good name." He touched the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "What do you think, James?" Ready to take on the world, the baby yawned in response, his tiny fist escaping the blanket to grasp Drake's finger with surprising strength. "I'll take that as a yes," Drake chuckled, then grew serious as he looked at Victoria. "Thank you for this gift, my love. For our son, and for making me the happiest man alive." Victoria smiled tiredly, happiness filling her despite her exhaustion. "We gave each other this gift, Drake, a family neither of us thought we'd have." Word of James's arrival spread quickly through Platteville. By the following morning, visitors began arriving with gifts and good wishes. Mrs. Wilkins brought a pot of hearty stew and practical advice about infant care. The Petersons sent a beautiful hand-carved mobile for the cradle. Even Emily Carson came, bearing a tiny knitted cap and booties. "My mother sends her congratulations as well," Emily said, somewhat awkwardly. "She's not well enough to visit herself, but wanted you to know she's thinking of you and the baby." Victoria accepted the olive branch with grace, inviting Emily to hold James briefly before the young woman departed. The most surprising visitor came late in the afternoon of the second day, Reverend Thomas, who had never before called at their home outside of official church business. "Mrs. Vaughn," he greeted Victoria, who was resting in a chair in the sitting room with James asleep in her arms. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Reverend," Victoria replied, curious about his visit. Drake offered the minister a seat and some coffee, which he accepted gratefully. "I've come," Reverend Thomas said after some polite conversation about the baby, "to speak to you about something that has been weighing on my conscience." Victoria and Drake exchanged a glance, unsure what to expect. "When you first returned to Platteville, Mr. Vaughn," the Reverend continued, addressing Drake, "I was among those who advised caution regarding your interest in Mrs. Vaughn." He looked uncomfortable but determined to continue. "I listened to gossip rather than Christian charity, and I allowed my sermons to be influenced by common prejudice rather than truth and compassion." Victoria was stunned by the confession. "Reverend," he held up a hand, "please, let me finish. When I saw you in pain at church yesterday, Mrs. Vaughn, and witnessed the devotion with which your husband tended to you, I was struck by the depth of love God has blessed you both with. And I realized that I, as a supposed man of God, had failed to recognize or honor that blessing." Drake's expression remained neutral, but Victoria could sense the tension in him. "I believe," Reverend Thomas concluded, "that God has shown us all the error of our judgment through the gift of your son. And I wish to be the first to formally apologize for my part in the unkindness you endured, Mrs. Vaughn, and to ask your forgiveness." Victoria was moved by the sincerity in the man's face. "There is nothing to forgive, Reverend. We all make mistakes in judgment." "That's very gracious of you," he replied, looking relieved. I would like to offer to christen young James whenever you feel ready. A proper welcome to the community for the newest Vaughn." After the Reverend had gone, Drake sat beside Victoria, gently taking James from her arms to allow her to rest. "That was unexpected," he commented. "It was," Victoria agreed. "But welcome, I think. Perhaps James's arrival has healed more than just our hearts." They decided to have James christened in mid-July, when Victoria had recovered enough to comfortably attend church. The ceremony was well attended, with most of Platteville turning out to witness the event. Victoria wore her best dress, altered to accommodate her post-pregnancy figure, and Drake looked handsome and proud in his Sunday suit. As they stood before the congregation, James nestled in Victoria's arms and Drake's hand warm at the small of her back. Reverend Thomas smiled at them with genuine warmth. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here to welcome this child, James Drake Vaughn, into the community of faith and into the loving embrace of his family and neighbors." Victoria looked out at the sea of faces, watching them, many of the same faces that had once judged her so harshly. Some still held remnants of their former attitudes, but many more showed genuine happiness for the family before them. Mrs. Wilkins was openly wiping tears from her eyes, while Mr. Peterson nodded approvingly at the proceedings. When the time came for Drake to hold James, Reverend Thomas nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Vaughn, as father of this child, do you promise to raise him in faith and love, to guide him toward righteousness, and to provide him with a home filled with God's grace?" Drake's voice was clear and strong as he answered, "I do so promise, before God and this congregation." Victoria's heart swelled with love as she watched her husband cradle their son, his expression a mixture of pride, tenderness, and fierce protectiveness. Then it was her turn to speak her promises, which she did with equal conviction. As she finished, James began to fuss slightly, tiny fists waving in the air. Reverend Thomas smiled. "And now, with the blessing of water, we welcome James Drake Vaughn into God's family and our community." He dipped his fingers into the baptismal font and gently touched James's forehead, making the sign of the cross. "James Drake Vaughn, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. May God's grace and blessing be upon you all the days of your life." James chose that moment to let out a lusty wail, causing a ripple of laughter to pass through the church. "He has a strong voice," Reverend Thomas observed with a smile. "A blessing for a boy growing up in the West." As they turned to face the congregation, Victoria felt Drake's arm slip around her waist, drawing her and James close against his side. "I present to you," Reverend Thomas announced, "the Vaughn family, blessed by God and welcomed by this community." The applause that followed was warm and genuine. As they moved down the aisle toward the door, Victoria was struck by how different this walk was from the one she'd made with Drake on their wedding day less than a year ago. Then, she had been hopeful but still carrying the weight of years of judgment. Now she walked with her head high, her husband beside her and their son in her arms, a woman fully recognized for who she truly was. Outside, in the bright July sunshine, friends and neighbors gathered to congratulate them and admire James, who had settled back to sleep in his mother's arms. "He's the image of his father," Mrs. Miller declared, peering at the baby's face. "But has his mother's eyes," Drake added proudly. "Those beautiful hazel eyes that first caught my attention." Victoria smiled up at him, remembering their first meeting in the general store, how Drake had held the door for her when no other man in town would have bothered. How much had changed since that day. As the crowd began to disperse, Drake leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Happy, Mrs. Vaughn, Victoria looked at the sleeping bundle in her arms, then at the man beside her who had restored her faith in love and in herself. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "More than I ever dreamed possible." Drake's smile was tender as he guided them toward home, his hand never leaving the small of her back. "This is just the beginning," he promised. "Just the beginning of our story." Epilogue. 5 years later, July 1881, Victoria Vaughn stood at the window of her classroom, watching as her students spilled out into the schoolyard for their midday break. Her gaze sought and found a dark-haired boy of 5, running to join a game with the easy confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and acceptance. James had grown into a sturdy, inquisitive child with his father's steady nature and his mother's thoughtful mind. Starting school this year had been a momentous occasion for all of them, especially since Victoria herself was his teacher. Outside, Drake appeared at the edge of the schoolyard, right on time for his daily visit. Victoria smiled as she watched James spot his father and race across the yard to be swept up into Drake's arms for their customary greeting. Behind her, a soft cooing sound drew Victoria's attention back to the cradle in the corner of the classroom, where 3-month-old Sarah was just waking from her nap. Victoria moved to lift her daughter, cradling the infant against her shoulder as she returned to the window. Drake was making his way toward the schoolhouse now, James riding on his shoulders and chattering enthusiastically about something that had his father nodding and smiling. Victoria's heart swelled with love for them both. When James had been about 2 years old, Victoria and Drake had begun to hope for another child. Months had passed without success, and Victoria had started to fear that perhaps the townsfolk had been partially right, that James had been a miracle not to be repeated. But Drake had never wavered in his faith that their family would grow when the time was right, and he had been right. Sarah Elizabeth Vaughn had arrived in early spring, a perfect counterpoint to her boisterous brother, with Victoria's auburn hair and Drake's blue eyes. The livery business had prospered under Drake's management, expanding to include a small horse breeding operation that was gaining a reputation throughout Colorado for quality stock. Victoria had continued teaching, becoming one of the most respected educators in the county. Their home had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family, with Drake adding rooms himself during the quieter winter months. Platteville had changed too. New families had moved in, bringing fresh perspectives and diluting the influence of those who had once been so judgmental. The Carsons had moved to Denver 2 years ago after Mr. Carson's investments in mining had finally paid off, and Emily had married a young lawyer from Boulder. Mrs. Wilkins remained their steadfast friend and neighbor, a doting honorary grandmother to James, and now to Sarah as well. She often said that watching the Vaughn's happiness had been the greatest joy of her later years. The schoolhouse door opened, and Drake entered, setting James down to run to his mother's side. "Mama, Papa's taking me to see the new foal after school," James announced, his eyes bright with excitement. "Is he now?" Victoria smiled, shifting Sarah to a more comfortable position. "And did you ask permission properly?" James nodded earnestly. "Yes, madam, I said please and everything." Drake crossed the room to kiss Victoria's cheek, then gently stroked Sarah's downy head. "How are my girls today?" "Wonderful," Victoria replied, leaning into his touch. "Sarah's been sleeping so well that I actually managed to teach fractions without interruption." Drake chuckled. "That's my girl, already supporting education." He glanced at the clock. "I should let you get back to your teaching. I just wanted to see you all before heading back to the livery." He knelt to be at eye level with James. "I'll see you after school, partner. Be good for your mother." "I will, Papa," James promised solemnly. Drake rose and gave Victoria another quick kiss. "I love you," he said softly. "All of you." "And we love you," Victoria replied, meaning it with her whole heart. After Drake had gone and James had run back outside to enjoy the rest of his break, Victoria sat in her chair at the front of the classroom. Sarah contentedly nestled in her arms. She looked around at the room filled with books and learning, at the doorway through which her son had just run, at the window through which she could see her husband walking back toward the livery. This was the life she had once thought forever denied to her: a loving husband, healthy children, meaningful work, and a place of respect in the community. The path to this happiness had not been easy, but every step, even the painful ones, had led her here. Outside, the school bell rang, signaling the end of the midday break. As her students began filing back into the classroom, Victoria smiled, remembering that moment in church 5 years ago when Drake had taken her hand before God and promised never to let go. He had kept that promise, and in doing so, had shown not just Victoria, but the entire town that love, faith, and second chances were possible for anyone brave enough to reach for them. As the last student took their seat and Victoria prepared to resume her lesson, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the man who had seen beyond judgment to the woman she truly was, for the children they had created together, and for the life they continued to build day by day. In the end, it wasn't about proving the gossips wrong or vindication for years of shame. It was about this classroom, these children, that little house where they'd make dinner together tonight. It was about James's laughter and Sarah's tiny fingers clutching hers. It was about Drake's arms around her in the darkness and his smile across a sunlit room. It was about love enduring, faithful, and stronger than any judgment or shame could ever be.